Welcome, everyone, to another webinar from the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations. My name is Nason Mahboubi, the director of the project, coming to you live from the city of Philadelphia, the home of the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. Of course, I'm absolutely delighted to continue our webinars with the project fellows of our second cohort of project fellows. Today, we will be talking to the Human Rights, Law, and Democracy team of our second cohort of project fellows. I do want to reiterate that we have a call for applications out for the third cohort of project fellows. Those applications are due at the end of February, and we're looking forward to read them and to assemble another great group. But at the moment, we're still in the midst of publishing the papers of our second cohort of project fellows, papers that have been workshopped over the course of the past year, including at the University of Pennsylvania, including at a week that we had in Beijing, including a week in Washington, D.C. And now they're being presented as working papers in these live broadcasts and will be finally published in their final forms later this spring. Let me invite the panelists for today's discussion to come up on stage so I can introduce them and get today's conversation started. Our project fellows for the Law, Human Rights, and Democracy team of the second quarter project fellows are Preston Jordan Lim, Assistant Professor of Law at Villanova University School of Law, and Lucie Liu, Postdoctoral Fellow at Princeton University Center for the Study of China, Contemporary China. Our moderator for today's discussion, Maggie Lewis, my good friend of many years and many different collaborations, who is professor of law at Seton Hall University Law School, where she also serves as vice dean and is currently coming to us live from Australia. So Maggie, it is always a delight to see you. This webinar is in wonderful hands with you. And so I am going to hand it over to you and look forward to learning from Preston and Lucie along with everyone else.
Well, thank you, and good morning from Australia, where I am on sabbatical. So I have thankfully shed my deaning duties and back to being a professor doing research. I will say, too, that there were fans for the Eagles here, mostly because we have a Bills fan in the family, so we wanted to see the Chiefs go down. But I do appreciate that this really is Penn Global, that we are coming from all parts of the planet, and it also is apropos of the topic with human rights and China. I was a part of the first cohort, albeit in a different grouping, the one about academic and scientific collaboration, not human rights and law and democracy that we're discussing today. However, there is a lot of overlap between those groups, as well as among other groups in this suite of papers that are being posted over the course of these mini webinars, and you can watch them all on YouTube. Now, I first went to China 30 years ago, which I think might have been even the same year, 1995, as Nason. And at that point, the concerns about human rights in China were really internally focused. It was about human rights abuses within the territorial confines of China. We are in such a dramatically different place today, where the conversation is so much more not just about what's happening within the PRC, but also about China's transnational reach in many ways. And that's what brings me here to Australia. And part of that is issues like transnational repression, reaching within other countries. There's many facets. And today we're going to explore two perspectives on this huge basket of issues. So first, we have international norms, how China is engaging with international human rights norms, what to do about that. And then secondly, looking about labor and other human rights abuses within China, but what kind of external responses should we seek to have? So let's get to this. We've got an hour, and I do want to say that we want to take time for questions from the audience. There is the Q&A function, so please put those in. But to kick us off, I wanted to turn to Lucie, and your paper is looking at this multi-year, multi-decade arc of China's engagement on the international sphere, starting from being really a norm taker and now being more of a norm shaper, and some would say a norm breaker in certain respects. So if you could just start us out by laying out some key findings and recommendations that you put forward in this paper.
Yes, thank you, Maggie, for this very kind introduction and summary of this paper. So in this paper, I've looked at how China shapes and engages human rights norms at one of the most important forums, that is UN Human Rights Council. And I find that consistently, China has promoted a development-focused approach to human rights, at the same time downplaying the civil and political rights. I think many observers will not be too surprised by this finding, but I think what strikes me is that many developing countries, namely global South countries, also align with this perspective, collectively shifting the UN's human rights discourse away from what we traditionally consider the core of the liberal focus, which is the civil and political rights. So my second finding is that China's economic engagement actually has a huge political payoff. So what I find is that those countries who benefit more from Chinese foreign aid and assistance programs tend to be more likely to align with China's visions of development-oriented human rights, echoing and championing China's moral leadership. However, the third finding is that not all the developing countries would be sensitive to China's economic influence. I identify several countries, many of them are not Western countries or less developed. They still remain very critical of China's human rights records, despite getting a lot of aid from China. So from these three findings, I provide three recommendations. First is the US should articulate why civil and political rights remain as essential and relevant to the human rights norms, particularly in the forums like the UN Human Rights Council. That means the US should consider rejoin Human Rights Council at the very least. The second recommendation is that the US foreign assistance program should be recognized as not as humanitarian needs, but as strategic tools. So China has learned a great lesson from the US about the political payoffs of foreign aid. So the US should not forget about this. The third recommendation, very briefly, is that to lead by example, Washington should be more forthcoming in acknowledging domestic human rights challenges, particularly concerning the marginalized and vulnerable population. With that, I will stop here and looking forward to more discussions.
Thanks. We've got a lot to cover, and I'm glad we have almost an hour to do that. But I want to start by just pausing on this word development. And you hear about developed countries, developing countries. Now on the international plane, we've got a conversation about having a covenant, a major treaty on the right to development as a human right. So I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a table setting of how Beijing conceives of the right to development as a human rights norm, and how, if at all, and I think it is, but is in tension with what some other conceptions of development include.
Yeah. Maggie, I think you actually are the expert on this topic, so feel free to add what your observations are. So for me, I think the vision of development to Beijing is more about the positive rights of the human rights. So that means the government would take the lead and plan for the economic development, plan for providing social assistance like housing, pension, etc. And for the less developed countries, the government will have the responsibility to provide the healthcare services, clean water, enough of food for people, and just alleviate poverty. So those kind of rights, they are more related to the substance and the living, and to improve the living standards of the populations would be more considered as development-based rights according to Beijing. So I think this part of the rights is that there's no problem of acknowledging this part of the rights, because a lot of the developing countries, those are the basic needs for the population. Improving their living standard is critical. I think what I'm concerning about is that if we only focus the centrality of human rights, and we spend too much time talking when we invoke human rights and we steer towards the development-based rights, then we'll have less room and less time to discuss other dimensions of time of rights, which are also very, very important, which is concerning about our civil and political rights, the rights of free speech, the rights of voting, etc.
Yeah, and I think this is a theme that runs across your two papers to the extent that, of course, economic well-being is critical. This is people need to have healthcare and they need to have money to feed themselves and their families. But that just saying it's about money leaves out so much of these civil and political rights, and we'll bring that back in. And so, shifting to Preston, where of course one thing is people need to earn a livelihood, right? And so we want the labor and labor rights, but what we've seen, of course, in China is these really just deep-seated issues with forced labor. And I remember I guess it was 2015 at a legal experts dialogue in Beijing when we had those things, that was the early stages of starting to hear more about the use of the legal system to focus on not just Uyghurs, but other members of Muslim Turkic minorities, sort of what it was their facial hair, was that suspect? And then in the years following, that of course blossomed into these just absolutely, widespread, really some of the horrific human rights violations happening, not just in Xinjiang, but that being the center, and forced labor being something that has been a real node for the U.S. to try to do with something about. So we're going to get to the U.S. part in a minute, but I wondered if you could just start by explaining sort of where the situation stands today with forced labor in Xinjiang, and your key sort of recommendations to put out there about what we, and I say this as an American, and others can do about it.
Thanks, Maggie. I think that's a great way of framing the question because the situation has evolved so quickly, just even within the past couple of years. And even just since I joined the PEN project, there's been a lot of movement on this one issue set. So it's a dynamic one to keep track of. Really what I'm looking at in this policy brief is tools that US policymakers can adopt or at least should advocate for in combating the modern Xinjiang forced labor system. And the first finding is really just to speak a little bit about what is going on in China with regards to this issue. Over the past couple of years, particularly since 2017, China has constructed, or the party state has constructed, a rather profitable system of forced labor. And I say system because Uyghur and other minority laborers are kind of placed into situations of forced labor across the country in a very organized way. So a lot of these factories and sites are located within Xinjiang itself, but many are actually within China, but outside of Xinjiang. And the other point to make there is that the products of this system range in terms of their economic value. You have goods that are on the low end of the economic value chain, so cotton, tomato-based products, but also quite sophisticated outputs, lithium, polysilicon, stuff that goes into global supply chains. The second point that I make in terms of my findings is that the United States has thus far actually led the way in many respects in the global fight against forced labor. It has, for example, enacted a very successful piece of legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. But my point is there are problems coming down the pipeline. The Trump administration recently announced the end of de minimis treatment for most Chinese products. The de minimis regime basically just meant that goods valued at or under $800 received lessened customs scrutiny. That's no longer going to apply to most Chinese products, which is going to mean that CBP personnel in the Trade Enforcement Division are going to have a lot more packages to sort through and to scrutinize. And then lastly, the finding is that I think the US stands to learn a great deal from how other jurisdictions have approached this problem. In particular, the European Union has adopted a directive on mandatory human rights due diligence which in a sentence basically imposes pretty sharp duties on private companies to ensure that their supply chains are free from forced labor. So to go over to my recommendations, the first major one is that the United States has an opportunity at one particular international institution, the International Labor Organization, to put some pressure on China. China recently, this is in 2022, ratified 2 forced labor conventions, and there are some options under the ILO Constitution to get some accountability for what China has done in Xinjiang. The second point flows from what I just talked about in terms of de minimis treatment. I make the argument that CBP's trade enforcement team really needs to get increased funding from Congress to deal with the coming deluge of shipments. And it's not just a question of technology, it's also a question of manpower. And then lastly, the White House should urge state governments to introduce and mandate that federal contractors implement Xinjiang-specific human rights due diligence legislation. Human rights due diligence legislation hasn't really picked up steam in the United States in the past, but I do think there's a potential here if we organize it around the framing concept of combating Uyghur forced labor.
Thanks. And again, I'm glad we have time to go through a lot of that, but I want to start with actually the sophistication of the system, because I think when these concerns first arose, it was focused on sort of more manual labor or sort of picking cotton or tomatoes and agricultural. And as you mentioned, this is a lot more complicated, technological. And so part of this, how much of this can you directly tie back to like the state party plan or the CCP? How much of this is opportunistic businesses that even if they might have a connection to the party, to the government, it's really more about making money and trying to get sort of the intentionality. How much of that intentionality can we tie back to Beijing and the top leadership directly, as opposed to just economic opportunism?
Right, so that's a great set of questions. I'll maybe say 2 things in response. So the first point is, of course, to say that there's a broader history in China of the use of forced labor and placing dissidents of the regime into forced labor situations. And that's a much older story. And this is a broad overgeneralization, but oftentimes when we were talking about the traditional outputs of forced labor in China, the goods were a little lower down on the value chain. So you had, many stories of toys being discovered, kind of online shipments of toys, and you'd open up the box and you'd find a note in there written by a prisoner. And I did say that, a lot of the goods do tend to be on the lower end of the value spectrum. But I think with China's growing economy, and I'll get to this point in a second, how China has mobilized various actors within the Chinese system, you do have a move up in the value chain. And so, for example, a lot of vehicle products, for example, car batteries, are alleged for a long time to have had inputs made via Uyghur forced labor, and solar panels, right? Polysilicon is a vital input for that. And there have been many allegations that basically a lot of that green revolution uses Uyghur forced labor inputs at times. To your second question about the role of different actors within the Chinese system, the answer is that this isn't just government, and that the government has laid down a lot of incentives to attract quasi-governmental and private allies to participate in the system. So let's just make that a little bit more tactile. The Chinese Party State, for example, has granted huge tax break policies to companies that are willing to relocate at least a part of their production process out to Xinjiang. Part of the deal is sometimes that these companies will get, or these sites will get, free energy for the first couple months, or at least energy at reduced rates. And the Party State has basically laid down these incentives to ensure that companies have every incentive, and sometimes there are punitive measures as well, to use Uyghur forced labor and to integrate Uyghur and minority forced labor in an important way into their supply chain.
No, thanks. That's helpful. And I appreciate that you put in the historical aspect, because of course, Laogai and having prison labor goes back many, many decades, certainly to the start of the PRC, and then Laodong Zhaoyang, or re-education through labor, which was a quasi-criminal, technically administrative, but criminal sanction, which has been officially gone for 10, 15 years, but was very much based on this idea that as part of a punishment or part of changing someone. And so there's some echoes and some similarities, but also this being distinct, that it's focused on a certain population, and also seems to be much more part of sort of an economic juggernaut. I want to stick with this idea of sophistication, but in a different way, shifting to Lucie, that you mentioned in your remarks and in your paper about the global South. And it used to be, when we thought of sort of beginning of Belt and Road Initiative or whatnot, that it was kind of, I don't know, not that sophisticated. Here's money, we're going to build a road, we're going to build a train line. And I wondered first if you could stop and give your sort of description of what is the global South? That term is used a lot, but I think people use it in different ways. And how helpful is it to lump, are these really countries that are like-minded, like interested? And then just give us a bit about how China is maybe not becoming more sophisticated, but my sense is that it's getting to be a more complicated and more nuanced way that Beijing is trying to interface with this group of countries that's under this general umbrella of the global South.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Maggie, for this great question. So you're right that like the Belt and Road Initiative is just a very broad concept. It's an umbrella concept that captures a lot of the countries that whether they choose to sign on officially sign on to Belt and Road initiatives or not, when they receive some part of development projects from China, they are actually part of this broader initiatives. So the formal agreement is not the key here, but the actual substance and the actual mechanism of providing development projects in the form of loans or aids are the key here. So in my paper, I defined Global South as countries who have ever received any kinds of development projects from China. For most, and I think in this paper, there are more than 150 countries that have in some form received the Belt and Road initiatives type of projects. So that is a large number of countries. Many of them obviously are middle and low income countries, and they are in need of basic infrastructures. So Chinese companies can come in and build roads, build bridges very effectively. So those are the traditional domains. And for the more advanced domains, like Preston has mentioned, China has advanced on green technology. So it also built a lot of pipelines, a lot of green infrastructure to help these countries to undergo energy transition if they want. At the same time, they can also choose to receive like 5G technology, like those kind of network build up from China. So there are a lot of projects, a lot of different types of projects going on. And what I want to highlight is that since 2000, so China has been really active in exporting and also investing in these developing countries. Now we will call it the Global South countries. And it has become the single largest financier to these countries. So that's why I'm very much interested in looking at in what way China have these like political returns, political payoffs from this massive amount of money, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars that it has given out to the global South.
Yeah, and this external push with money and ideas, of course, BRI was the old school way of framing it. And then China launched these various initiatives, security, civilization, but also the Global Development Initiative. And I find that interesting because it has also more of the interaction with the UN having recognition of there being a friends of the Global Development Initiative. So it's not just bilateral. But sticking with this idea of geography for a minute, Preston, you're focused on Xinjiang, understandably. That's been the real locus of all this. But you mentioned that this is also forced labor that's spreading to other parts of China. So kind of, I guess, multiple parts. How much is this intentional to sort of say we're going to hide it, or is it just there's other parts of China that needs forced labor, so that's why it's going there? Sort of how much is this occurring with other sort of the non-Turkic minorities, the other non-Han peoples of China, whether it's Tibetans or others? Is this really about this certain group of people? And then finally, is it spilling outside the borders? I'm thinking there was the case where there were Chinese construction companies in Saipan, which were using forced labor. Are we still really talking about forced labor within the confines of the territorial limits of China, or is it seeping even beyond that?
That's a great set of questions. So I'll say three things. The first point is to talk about, I guess, China's minority policy more broadly. And the specific point that I want to make here is that a lot of the methods that we've seen developed in Xinjiang, they don't stay in Xinjiang. Or they didn't originate in Xinjiang. And the example that I'll give is to point to the example of the last party secretary in Xinjiang. So the current one is Ma Xingrui, but the last one was Chen Quanguo. And before he was party secretary in Xinjiang, he was party secretary in Tibet. And he did kind of from the party's perspective very well in Tibet in pioneering a lot of different methods of surveillance and repression. And when he went to Xinjiang, built upon many of those methods and was instrumental, arguably one of the key architects in building kind of this modern surveillance state that exists still in that region. And so you see kind of a crossover between policies in Tibet and policies in Xinjiang. And that's an example of kind of a broader point of the treatment of at least certain minorities across the country. The second point is to say that I think there's a mix of reasons as to why forced laborers from Xinjiang are now spread out all over the country. I do think the two main reasons: number one, economic. So it is still relatively kind of economic from the party state's perspective to send big batches of Uyghur forced laborers to places like Shandong to work in the agricultural industry there, so kind of seafood processing, things like this. But also a big part of it is, of course, cultural. It isn't just economic. There's the belief that kind of by dislocating Uyghurs and other minoritized individuals from their home setting, they will be further assimilated into the dominant Han-based culture. The third point, I do take your point about kind of, maybe we want to call it transnational repression, the deployment of forced labor outside of China's borders. I haven't seen too many examples of Uyghur forced laborers being dispatched to sites outside of China. But I think one issue, and I know it's on the administration's mind, is the pressure that China has placed on certain countries to extradite Uyghurs back to China. So the most recent example of this, of course, being Thailand, under a lot of pressure to send quite a few Uyghurs back to Xinjiang, where they will undoubtedly face adverse conditions. And this links in with Lucie's point. I guess the last thing that I'll say is, given China's economic heft in many parts of the global south and really around the world, it is able to exercise influence to further kind of the subjugation of Uyghurs and other minoritized individuals, even if those individuals are now located outside of Chinese borders.
And this point about the movement of people and China requesting people back, of course, that's a huge issue. Has also been part of the anti-corruption campaign, trying to go through Interpol, red notices, and other ways to get countries to return people. And so much of this puts in the center stage this issue of civil and political rights. So extradition is a very formal process that's used to return someone to a country. There's a lot of other ways that people can be physically physically transferred. US, a lot of this is through really immigration processes and removal of people from the US, even if it's not technically extradition. And so I think there's this brings to the center about whether countries should send anyone back to China, especially if they could face forced labor or a criminal processes, where would they get even sort of the basic rights that are in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to have a meaningful defense, to have a fair trial. And so I think I want to go back to Lucie, and then I'll tack on Preston's question so you can think about that while she's answering. In your paper, Lucie, you say, and this was not surprising, but interesting to see empirically driven, that China and in the UN doesn't like talking about civil and political rights, right? And so part of it, I'm wondering sort of how much of it is a matter of just China, the Chinese government not talking about this, and how much are they actually trying to redefine or reshape what civil and political rights mean. So I'm thinking, for example, in the way that Xi Jinping's government talks about democracy and saying, we do have democracy. We have whole process people's democracy. You don't have to have periodic times where the populace was over a certain age, with certain credentials, goes to a polling place or puts in the mail a vote. That's not necessary for democracy. We're listening to people, which goes, of course, way back to some conceptions about from the Mao time even. So how much of this is ignoring? How much of this is reshaping? And then thinking about that more on Preston's side, you talk about the ILO, right, the International Labor Organization, and trying to activate that, which is, of course, a key organization for activating civil and political rights, the rights of workers, of labor. And here, I mean, you're preaching to the choir who wants these IOs, these international organizations, to be full-throated and robust. But putting on my mom hat, where we've seen every Marvel movie, this is not like when you get these IOs together, it's not like the Avengers assemble and they can take down Ultron and they have real firepower. They have norms, they have meetings. And so if you could just maybe delve in a little bit more about how you think that getting a fire under the ILO has hope for actually moving the needle and changing what is happening in China's practices. So start with Lucie, and then Preston can jump in.
Sure. Thank you so much for this question. So this question about whether China deliberately try to ignore civil and political rights, or it tries to redefine the meaning of it. I think this is a great way to think about this different ways of reshaping human rights norms. I think China is doing both, but in my project, I focus more on the former side. So I would say that it deliberately tries to not talk about it. Why is that case? Because the UN Human Rights Council, countries participate in universal periodic review. This is a very unique forum because all the UN members will participate. However, they only have very limited time to discuss the countries under review, that is being under review, and suggest what it should focus on. So in my data, I look at how China reviews everybody and how China receives the reviews from everybody. So in terms of how China reviews everybody, you're absolutely right. China deliberately chooses to not talk about civil and political rights. It's not because it's not important. It's just because it does not want to talk about it. It does not want to talk about it because it does not want to be talked about. So in this very limited time, it does not have time to redefine what that means. What China tries to do is deliberately not allocate time to talk about this very important dimension of human rights norms. And collectively, what I find is the Global South also aligns with this conceptualization of human rights norms. So collectively, if we look at how the over 150 countries talk about human rights norms, altogether, they also allocate very, very minimum time to talk about civil and political rights. So if we think about the topics that will be covered in this one of the most important human rights forums, you see that there used to be the core idea of human rights norms have been allocated very, very little time and very, very little attention to be discussed when the norms are being articulated among the states. So I find that in this specific forum, China's deliberation of not talking about civil and political rights is one way to reshape and redefine human rights.
Great. Preston?
Great. First thing I'll just say, thanks for the note about kind of the definition or the delineation between extradition and deportation, because it's absolutely true. And in this case, I should have actually been more precise. What the Uyghurs in Thailand are facing, that's deportation, although individual Uyghurs have actually been extradited to China in the past, for example, from Morocco. But getting to this question about the ILO, and it is, I think, such a relevant question in light of this administration's recent stance on various international bodies, we haven't seen the same disavowal of the ILO. I will say that, and that's a positive sign. But really, the big question here is, what's the upshot of action at the ILO? Because China's ratified these two forced labor conventions, it did so in 2022, as I mentioned earlier, that means that countries that have also signed on to either or both of those conventions can file under the ILO Constitution a complaint. Okay, that's under Article 26 of the Constitution. And a complaint just allows a country to allege that another country that is bound by the convention or conventions is in breach of its international obligations. Now, the trick here is actually the United States is maybe not the best placed country to file a complaint here, for the reason that it's only signed on to one of those two conventions. So the United States might convince one of its allies to bring a complaint. It might still bring a complaint under that one convention. But really the point here is that so much of the language focused on what's going on in Xinjiang that's come from countries around the world, a lot of that language has been national in scope. So you see parliaments, for example, condemning what is going on in Xinjiang as genocide or as crimes against humanity. You have, former Trump administration figures when they were still in government, like Mike Pompeo, saying that what was going on in Xinjiang was genocide. And these aren't international law documents, right? And so the hope here is that following, if the governing body of the ILO chooses to proceed with a complaint, it can set up a commission of inquiry, which would, I think, find that China is in breach of certain of its obligations. And while that's not kind of the most binding type of international law you could get, it is persuasive. And I think it's worth a lot more than a national determination just from one country or even a set of Western countries saying that what's going on in Xinjiang violates international law. To actually have more UN-affiliated bodies come out and make findings on the basis of international law, that's much harder, in my opinion, for the Chinese government to simply dismiss.
Yeah, and this is, sort of how much of this is getting the message out in all these different ways so it gets some traction. What are the best methods to do that subnationally, nationally, internationally? And this is, of course, so in flux right now, in particular, as the Trump administration gets its momentum going. And actually, it landed with so much momentum. I mean, it's been a blur. Wake up every morning here and wonder what happened while I slept. And so I think I want to start transitioning to that, but just first, going back to Lucie's point about the reporting procedures in the UN, and in particular, these universal periodic reviews, these comprehensive overviews of a country's human rights practices. And these are done in such a truncated manner in the actual UN sort of meeting. Of course, there's a lot of reports and pages of documents that are leading up to that moment of actually having the UPR. But there have been well-documented questions about how that process plays out, who can participate. Shout out to the work when Sophie Richardson was at Human Rights Watch. I'd say China Media Project, David Bandersky and his crew have done a lot of great work looking at how China is working to shape how the UPR happens. And that's something which I think, we need to continue to show a spotlight on. But I'm gonna stay with Preston for a second and then go to you, Lucie. But so on the US side, so Preston, when you look at the response to Xinjiang and forced labor, you mentioned Parliament, so we got Congress, right? And Congress, as you discuss in your paper, has been critical in passing legislation over now many years, or several years, to have these responses to forced labor. And in fact, two people who were quite vocal in doing that were Mike Waltz, now at NSC, and Marco Rubio, now at State. And so I'm wondering if you could, I know crystal balls and everything are hard, but what role do you see Congress playing as we continue, the US continues to address forced labor, and might this transfer of some key individuals into the Trump administration give us some optimism about coordination, given despite lots of challenges? And then after that, Lucie, going to you, unlike ILO, which has not been directly in the crosshairs for Trump administration, there was an executive order earlier this month that kind of maybe got lost for most people in the flurry of EOs that said flat out the US is not going to participate in the UN Human Rights Council. And of course, we've also seen the dismantling, the putting into some sort of stasis, unclear exactly where US AID is, but certainly just more generally, this being involved in human rights outside of our borders is very much something the Trump administration is focused on. So to what extent is it, do you think, really going to matter? We weren't in the Human Rights Council at times under Trump 1.0. How devastating or not is that to what you hope the US can do in these respects? So yeah, Preston, can you bring some optimism to this conversation?
Sure. Well, I'm going to do the classic lawyerly thing and say that there are reasons to be optimistic and also maybe some reasons to be pessimistic. But why don't we start with the good news? So I think you're absolutely right that there are key individuals within this administration that are really tuned into the Uyghur issue. And Secretary Rubio has been on top of this issue for years. He was critical in Congress in spotlighting and spearheading a lot of legislation related to the fight on Uyghur forced labor, and I have every confidence that he's going to maintain that focus. The other element of, the other reason for positive thinking is that there is a lot that Congress can do, and I do think that Congress will continue to be willing to act on this issue by, for example, hopefully diverting more resources to CBP, and I trust that, as we've seen in recent weeks, the executive branch is going to continue to strengthen the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. A couple of weeks ago, a whole number of companies were added to the entity list of the UFLPA. That just refers to the set of companies and products from those companies. When they come into the United States, they are assumed to violate the international prohibition on forced labor. So there's been a lot of action on this front, both from Congress and the executive branch. I expect it to continue. There's some reason for pessimism, and I'll just focus on one of those aspects, and that is that while I think it's impossible really to speak about a full solution to this problem and pressuring China into completely dismantling the forced labor system in Xinjiang and outside of Xinjiang, it is true that the United States certainly can't do it on its own. And the United States is going to need to work closely with allies if it wants to ensure that Uyghur forced labor products aren't coming into the United States, right? So oftentimes a lot of goods that leave China are first shipped to another country before they come into the United States. This is called transshipment. And it really complicates the ability of CBP to ensure that tainted goods are not coming into the United States. And I guess the point I'd make is to get allies like Canada and Mexico, allies in Europe on board, and to really implement robust legislation that is modeled off of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There's going to need to be an approach taken of true cooperation, and it's hard for me to see how allies that are being tariffed are going to have any incentive whatsoever to abide by this administration's China policy.
So before turning to Lucie, I just want to do a quick follow-up there. And you mentioned Customs and Border right Protection, who does this. And earlier on, you mentioned there used to be a de minimis exception involved in these various acts of Congress. And my understanding is that de minimis exception allowed perhaps some more than a small hole in this, particularly through online retailers. And so if you could just give a sense of, first of all, how much does it matter to get rid of that de minimis exception? How unhappy might Bezos be about that? And also, even if it's formally now removed, a little bit more information about just how actually enforcing that, enforcing this, do we have the manpower? Do we have the equipment to try to actually implement a law that does not have a de minimis exception in it?
Yeah, so it's a really important question. I have been pushing for kind of a tightening of this loophole for some time now. The de minimis exception presented a huge problem because, so just to summarize again, right? So goods, low value goods at or below $800, subject to much less rigorous customs scrutiny. And that meant that a lot of e-shopping goods could be imported into the United States. And a lot of the goods that were bought on online Chinese platforms were goods that contained Uyghur forced labor inputs, right? So maybe you're buying a set of Chinese sneakers, maybe the materials in that set of sneakers were made by forced laborers. So it's a great thing that the Trump administration has more or less closed that loophole for Chinese products. I should say that the Biden administration, towards the end of its tenure, had basically suggested its clear intention through the administrative process to at least narrow that loophole and to impose more restrictions on the use of the de minimis exception. But the problem now is that so many products benefit from de minimis treatment, and in particular, a huge chunk of de minimis shipments into the United States come from China. So the idea that these millions of shipments now need to be subjected to the same scrutiny, the same process that goods valued above $800 are already subject to, there's just going to be a huge enforcement issue. Trade enforcement at CBP is understaffed. And I guess the point that I'd underline here is you see a lot of kind of talk online about the importance of AI here and the importance of technology, and that is true to a large extent. Technological tools can abet tracking. They can allow border officials to act in a much more targeted way. But a lot of this stuff is still manual in nature, right? Actually opening up shipments, checking what's in them, sorting packages. So the idea that CBP is going to be able to handle this huge influx in products without extra manpower is very foolish, in my opinion.
So this is starting to sound kind of old school. I started by saying I went to China 30 years ago. One thing I did was work at a law firm that was working on protecting counterfeit Beanie Babies from being created and taken to the US. And that was a lot of opening of suitcases at SFO or EWR or whatever, and looking for a pile of Beanie Babies, which at the time were worth a lot on eBay. So Lucie, yeah, going to you now, and this question about, US pulling out, Human Rights Council pulling away. How much does this matter? What do we do? And maybe is it, something that there's alternative mechanisms, pathways for engagement that you see perhaps emerging, again, recognizing you do not have the power to get into the mind of Donald Trump or Xi Jinping or anyone else who's the real decision makers in these processes?
Yeah, so I do agree that a lot of the news happened right in the past few weeks, and I think the dismantling USAID was was one of the dramatic news that we have seen. So that makes the news about Trump pulling out of UN Human Rights Council receives less of attention. But in fact, that has a huge consequence on the U.S. participation in the UN human rights bodies, because, like my paper has shown that even though the U.S. was a big part of or play a big role in UN Human Rights Council, China, the authoritarian country, has already been really successful at advocating this alternative norm, or passing a lot of resolution, or getting a lot of votes from their friendly circle to kind of reshape the norms of human rights. So in that sense, if the US is no longer a part of the UN Human Rights Council, then it does not have the opportunity to steer the conversation, or to sponsor or co-sponsor a resolution that can represent the core of the Western allies in protecting civil and political rights, or to condemning atrocities committed by different countries in different contexts, etc. Or it does not, no longer has the opportunity to provide support to the robust civil society in the US to kind of advocate for a group like Uyghurs in China. So there are a lot of impacts happening with regard to this decision of pulling out UN Human Rights Council. And related to that, the dismantling USAID also suggests to the broader international community that first, humanitarian aid is no longer a priority, or no longer a part of the foreign policy in the US. And part of these aid packages in the past has attached with the conditions of good governance, of democratization, of opening up the market, of respecting vulnerable populations' rights, such as women, LGBTQ, or children's rights, etc. All of those elements, in addition to the actual assistance, or the vaccines, or the healthcare services operated by hundreds and thousands of US aid workers overseas, are basically gone within a few days. So I think that has a devastating consequence to the future of the US foreign policy, and that raise a lot of uncertainty and doubt to the US allies like Japan or EU. They don't understand, they don't know what to do and how to continue to work with the current administration, given that there are such abrupt changes in terms of its foreign policy initiatives.
All the more reason to have a third cohort to keep following these issues. As we get to the end of this webinar, I want to think about metrics a little bit, and how we define success and in the realm of human rights. And so, for example, Preston was mentioning about some moves towards the end of the Biden administration. Well, one thing also that happened was a very high-profile sort of prisoner swap, or getting out of China some held Americans, some of them who have been there for years. And they're very clear metric when you have something like that a massive change in an individual's life, to go from a fully carceral, liberty-deprived situation to being returned to their family. But then you have these much more amorphous goals when it comes to sort of loosening these changing norms, and maybe a metric is blocking a resolution that China's trying to get in, sometimes quite overtly, other times within sort of deep in the bureaucracy of the UN, that might even sound fine on the surface, but has the ability to dilute or sort of eat away at some of the fabric of human rights norms. And with forced labor, part of it is how much of this is about actually thinking we're going to change the practices within China, and how much of it is saying that as external audiences, we are not going to be complicit. We're not going to be facilitating of these happenings. So maybe as we get towards the end, if you could both think a little bit, or say a little bit about how do we measure success, and what should we be looking for as your papers go out in the world, and then we look to the next year, or whatever period might be. Either one can go first.
Sure, maybe I'll go, and I'll keep it quick. So I think the question is a really hard one in the case of what's going on in Xinjiang. It's ironic. This is a field in which there's a lot of quantification, right? So we have all these CBP numbers on number of shipments seized each year, dollar value of those shipments. But the quantification really doesn't tell us all that much at the end of the day, I think, when it comes to how much success the United States has encountered in its fight against Uyghur forced labor. I really think the goal here is ensuring that the United States economy is as free of Uyghur forced labor as possible. Shipments are always going to get through. The forced labor system in China is going to continue for the foreseeable future. But it would be a massive violation of international law and a huge moral oversight, I think, to just do business as usual in the United States. And that clearly has not been the approach of Congress, of the Biden or of the Trump administration so far. And so in as much as the United States can continue to calibrate executive branch and legislative tools to ensure that Uyghur forced labor shipments aren't ending up in the United States on store shelves, that really is what we should all be after.
I will also be quick. So I think right now, what we will hope to see is the U.S. re-engage back to the UN Human Rights Council and become a member of it. So I think that is a minimum that to show that the U.S. will continue to commit to the human rights principles and also want to engage with the conversations multilaterally. So I think the second of all is that in addition to re-engage and re-participate in the UN Human Rights Council, it also needs to acknowledge that a lot of the criticism, a lot of the recommendation it has received from the Global South countries or from the EU members as well. So over the years, at least from my observation, the U.S. has received a lot of critical feedback from countries regarding how to improve its human rights conditions, including how to further protect immigrants' rights, how to protect women's rights, etc. So I think the second step will be to make concrete improvements on its domestic human rights conditions and show that it's willing to listen to others' feedback and continue to make improvement.
Well, I want to thank both of you. It's really been a pleasure to engage with you today, as well as with these papers over the last year or so, and of course, going forward. And I'll say it's already Valentine's Day where I am, and I think of all the different cohorts, the different thematic groups within this project, that this one is. I mean, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of our heads, but there's a lot of heart. Right? You don't do this work without really believing that it's worth putting our energy into democracy, law, human rights, and that one of the challenges we face and will continue to face, no doubt, is that we're not going to get easy wins. Not getting the participation medal, we don't care. We want to see something get better, but to be in it for the long haul. So with that, I'm gonna hand it back to Nason, and again, thank you for all of your work on these issues.
Thank you all. This was such a fantastic discussion. Maggie, you did just a masterful job moderating, as always. I learned a ton. I can't wait for us to share the video more broadly with all the different audiences for the project. Just to remind viewers that we are still have 2 more sets of webinars to go as we're unfolding the papers of the second cohort of fellows. So next week, same time, same place, we'll be hearing from the National Security Fellows, and then the week after that, the Research, Education, and Academic Freedom Fellows. So thank you all once again for a really spectacular discussion. And to all the viewers, thanks for joining, and see you again next week, same time, same place.